Welcome, everybody. We are very excited to have you all here. Please keep welcoming people into the room as they arrive. As we know, because of the weather and because of the security desk and other things, folks will be kind of trickling in, including the person for whom this talk is named, who I know is coming but will be late. So at some point I may wave at him. We are thrilled to have you all with us today in person and virtually. There are lots and lots of folks online joining us also today. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Amanda Lewis. I'm the director of the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy here at UIC. For those of you who are new to IRRPP, we work to create, support, and amplify cutting-edge research on racial and ethnic dynamics that is deeply engaged with not only trying to understand, but to transform the conditions of underrepresented groups. The Bowman Lecture is our signature event each year, focusing on providing timely analyses of issues of race, equity, and justice facing us today. This lecture is named after the first permanent director of IRRPP, Philip J. Bowman, both because of his important leadership of the Institute and because of his prolific record as a scholar and as a mentor. All of us who have benefited from the work of IRRPP over the last 25 years owe a debt of gratitude to Dr. Bowman for his strategic nurturance of the Institute at its beginning. He set a strong foundation that we have worked hard to build on in the years since. Many of us owe a debt of gratitude to him also for his wisdom and insight that he has shared generously with generations of scholars across his career. He's currently a professor of higher education at the University of Michigan. I have been lucky now to have known him for almost 30 years, and it's a personal goal of mine and a collective goal of our staff to walk in the path he has forged as a scholar and as a person. He is the ultimate intellectual, deeply engaged in understanding why things are the way they are and how to transform them in ways that create opportunity. We think about him a lot as we plan for this event each year and feel challenged to do work that is purposeful and that has deep integrity to it. Before I introduce the speakers, I want to say a few thanks. Thanks to our staff who have worked very hard to put this together. Deanna Lewis, who's in the room, Cindy Brito, who's in the room. They're not going to wave. Yeah. Allison Raddick, who's downstairs, and also Ivana Rennes, who can't be here with us today, but who co-created this wonderful panel with Lisa Lee and Tiff Beatty, who's over there. Thank you, waving right away, from the National Public Housing Museum, who are collaborators for this event today. Thanks also to the law school and to Terry McMurtry-Chubb, who is on the law school faculty and part of the IRRPP executive committee and who helped us secure this space. For those online, please note that we are recording this event. We are using Zoom's version of live transcription to caption the event. And although it is getting better, it is not the best, and we apologize for mistakes. The chat is off for participants, though we may drop links there during the talk. But we ask you to please use the Q&A feature to post questions. And when we go to the Q&A, we will repeat questions in the room for those who can't see them so that everybody can hear them. And now to the focus for today's event. At IRRPP, we have been collaborating for the last 18 months with the Illinois Office to Prevent and End Homelessness, convening a racial equity roundtable to understand racial disparities in homelessness in the state, and in particular to understand the structural drivers of the vastly disproportionate rate of Black homelessness in the state. For those of you who don't know, Illinois is second only to New York in the overrepresentation of Black folks among the unhoused. We are part of many groups locally who have been giving necessary attention to how and why so many in our community struggle to get their basic need for safe and dignified shelter met. Whether it be newly arriving immigrants or long-term residents struggling to find affordable and safe housing, we stand with all of those pushing for policy that treats housing as a right rather than a privilege. And Lisa put some great swag outside for folks who want a little sticker along these lines. While our focus here is on the struggle for housing locally, I also want to pause for a moment to recognize that movements for justice here are always connected to movements for peace and justice everywhere. The patterns of dehumanization that enable us to fail to recognize the needs of parts of our community locally are connected to the deep disregard that allows for the brutal violence, starvation, and destruction of thousands of homes and lives abroad, places like Gaza right now. There is so much in the world right now that has us all deeply worried and sad and furious, but we are so glad to have collaborators with us here who are helping to imagine new possible futures. Now to the introductions of this amazing panel, and I'll keep them short because we have time to hear from them. We will hear first from Lisa Lee. She's a cultural activist and the executive director of the National Public Housing Museum. She is also an associate professor in art history and gender and women's studies at UIC, part of the teaching faculty with the Prison Neighborhood Arts Project, and a member of Chicago Torture Justice Memorials. Mary Pattillo will be next. She's the Harold Washington Professor of Sociology and Chair, again, I see, of the Department of Black Studies at Northwestern University. She's the author of many critical books and articles centering on her on her areas of interest, including race and ethnicity, urban sociology, inequality, housing, educational, criminal legal studies, and Black communities. The city of Chicago offers an abundance of opportunities for research and activism, and Dr. Pattillo strives to be an expert in Chicago history, politics, and social life. Then we'll hear from Ernst Valery, who is the founder and president of SAAEBI and Equero Fund. Did I say that right? Equero Fund. I knew it. Gosh, I was going to mess that up. A real estate development and private investment firm committed to building healthy, stable communities that are characterized by multi-income, multi-ethnic, and multi-generational populations. Their corporate and individual mission is to go beyond bricks and mortar to instill strong social impact and equity that ensures a real measurable benefit to the communities and people they serve. They also seek to disrupt who gets to develop property and community by investing in women, minority and immigrants. Karen Leone is president of the board, and along with her family of mariachi musicians, is a resident of the Pilsen Housing Cooperative, or PICO, as we fondly call it, which is a limited equity scattered site housing cooperative that currently owns 3 buildings and 18 units of permanently affordable family residences where longtime residents of Pilsen are taking a stand against gentrification and displacement. And finally, ShaDawn Boobie Battle is a multidisciplinary artist, researcher, activist, and educator whose work spans mediums, including documentary films, performances, and public talks. She is the National Public Housing Museum's 5th artist as instigator, and her creative practice is rooted in transformative justice and creating platforms for the most marginalized communities to engage in truth-telling practices.
Thank you, Amanda. Awesome. All right. And thanks all of you for being here, sort of braving the weather. It's always that time in April that we get to listen to the Prince song. Sometimes it snows in April, right? And it's like, not like we don't really want it, but we want to listen to that song. Yeah. So, I appreciate you. And to all the staff at IRRPP, I also want to give a call out to Mark Jaschke, the staff of NPHM, for all of his work. And of course, to my colleague Tiff also. And I really love this lecture each year. And over the years, I've come to learn not just about an amazing host of policy issues that have the intersection of race, class, and gender, but also I've loved learning about Dr. Bowman and his legacy. So I really appreciate that. I want to begin by recognizing that the region we now call Chicago is native land. This land has been cared for by many indigenous nations, including the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi people. Many other tribes like the Miami, the Ho-Chunk, the Menominee, the Sac, and the Fox have also called this area home. This place now includes the largest urban American Indian community in the United States, and they continue to contribute to the life of the city and care for the land in other ways. This land was also the home to the first non-native naturalized citizen of the Potawatomi, John who lived here with his wife, Kitty Hawa, who was a Potawatomi woman whom he married in 1770. Kitty Hawa was displaced from her home by the U.S. government through a series of forced escapes from approximately 60,000 Native Americans. And when the National Public Housing Museum opens our permanent site in the last remaining building of the Jane Addams homes, we will be located in a building where many families were also displaced due to the last phase of urban renewal in the city. Our mission at the museum is to fight for the right for all people to a place to call home. Remembering these stories of displacement and finding ways to honor their histories does not change the past, but an understanding of the places that we live, where we love and work, and the ongoing consequences of this past can empower us to create a better future for all of us. Here are some facts to begin with. We're living in a country of stolen land built on stolen labor. There's not a single county in the United States where a full-time minimum wage worker can afford a modest two-bedroom apartment. 89 countries make explicit reference to housing rights in their constitutions. This list does not include the United States. The most recent point-in-time count identified more than 6,100 people experiencing homelessness in Chicago, and the recent Bring Chicago Home ballot initiative would have created a dedicated line item in the budget to address this crisis, but it was narrowly defeated. Our city and many other cities across the country are grappling with a new great migration of migrants to our cities, and while for some the fight is to establish a new home, for others, it is to resist displacement and stay in place. In 2021, the typical white household had 9.2 times as much wealth as a typical Black household, $250,400 versus $27,100. One of the biggest disparities driving this is housing. A home is the most valuable thing many people will ever own, and buying a nicer home in a nicer neighborhood has always been the easiest way to climb up the socioeconomic ladder. But that option hasn't been available to everyone, especially Black families. Is housing a human right? Is it a public good and a part of our Commonwealth where we can all make claims and just thrive like clean air and clean water? Or is it a commodity, a place to grow individual and family wealth, a place to make bank for certain industries or otherwise? Can these two ideas be held at the same time, or are they so fundamentally contradictory? Today's conversation with a group of some of my favorite people assembled is going to help us think through these questions, through critical analysis, through practice, through cultural projects that are unleashing our radical imaginations about our history and also the future of housing. As a public historian, I like to go upstream, and for us that means going back in time and asking, how did it get this way and how might it be otherwise? One of my favorite stories is when Daniel Burnham was almost finished with the 1909 plan for Chicago. He visited the well-known social reformer and peace activist Jane Addams at the Hull House settlement, now the Jane Addams Hull House Museum on part of the UIC campus. Burnham traversed to the west side at that time, which was the heart of Chicago's working class and immigrant populations, and also the place of the most overcrowded and dangerous tenements, to ask this single unanswered question about his perfectly laid out city. Where do the poor people live? There were absolutely no provisions for housing, absolutely none, in this ambitious effort to make no little plans. His effort to reimagine a rapidly growing city was, after all, a proposal to beautify and improve efficiency in business and commercial enterprises. In 2000, the Chicago Housing Authority launched an even more ambitious effort called the Plan for Transformation. With a massive budget funded for the most part by federal government's Hope 6 program, an acronym for Home Ownership Opportunities for People Everywhere, the plan proposed a, quote, fundamentally new approach to public housing in Chicago. One of the first actions was the bulldozing of 11 high-rise public housing developments that, when demolished, represented the largest net loss of affordable housing in the history of the United States. Say their names: Robert Taylor Homes, Henry Horner Homes, Ida B. Wells Homes, Jane Addams Homes, Grace Abbott Homes, Harold Ickes Homes, Stateway Gardens, Randolph Towers, Loomis Courts, Robert Brooks Homes, Cabrini Green. These names will conjure feelings and thoughts in the popular imagination, usually not of the vibrant communities that live there, nor the people who formed imaginative and complex networks of support and long-lasting friendships, but of stereotypes of what it means to be poor and Black in America. Due to a long, deeply racialized history, public housing and the people who live there have been regarded with deep suspicion and resentment. In the prevailing ahistorical narrative, public housing is a failed social policy. But a brief history reveals that the National Housing Act of 1937 helped to build subsidized housing for millions of working class Americans devastated by the Great Depression. And that at one point, the US government's mandate was to provide, quote, a decent home and suitable living environment for every American family, the exact words in the National Housing Act of 1949. Scholars like Mary Pattillo, Ben Austin, Roberta Feldman, Rhonda Williams, Akira Drake, Audrey Petty, and the oral histories of public housing residents, or the poetry of Gwendolyn Brooks and others, bear witness and provide counter narratives and analysis for us to recognize the histories of resilience and resistance, of innovative entrepreneurship, of care, of generosity, women's leadership on one hand, and on the other hand, systemic racism, economic injustice that informed failed public housing policies. This included police acting with impunity, chronic disinvestment, the crumbling and unsafe buildings due to deferred maintenance. Explicit government policies at the local, state, and federal levels work to ensure segregation, and ruthless policies of redlining, racially exclusionary mortgages, and then racially predatory housing policies and inequities around education, health, labor, and policing all contributed to the creation of an almost exclusively African-American population in public housing in Chicago and in many cities in the United States. It is true that the plan for transformation sought to deliberately disrupt entrenched patterns of segregation and concentrated poverty and address crumbling, unsafe buildings. At the core, it was also an ambitious effort of social engineering called mixed income housing that integrates public housing residents into the larger economic and physical fabric of Chicago. It is, however, not clear why or how the idea of people living in poverty, living next door to people with money, became the solution to actually alleviating and addressing the root causes of poverty. It is clear that by creating mixed income developments and a voucher system for long-term rent subsidy contracts in privately owned developments, the city intentionally shifted much responsibility for housing and management to the private sector. Housing as a commodity in a market economy in this private sector versus housing as a right and a basic necessity. Is it possible for homes to be for profit and also a right? Housing insecurity is one of the most persistent and urgent challenges for the majority of city dwellers today. The impact and reverberations of the plan for transformation, the lack of public and affordable housing for everyone, is something that our city and other cities across the country need to vigilantly question, explore, and demand accountability for. This summer, the National Public Housing Museum will finally open in the last remaining building of the Jane Addams home. Public housing residents, joined by scholars, activists, preservationists, and many others, believe in the power of place and memory and are working together to create a museum that will be a place to preserve, promote, and propel the right of all people to a place where they can live and prosper, a place to call home. Residents organized to save the building from demolition, and collectively, we believe in this civic and cultural organization that will be a site of conscience, a site of resistance against erasure and forgetting, a place to ask critical questions about history and unleash our collective imaginations for the future and to create solutions, to bridge creativity and storytelling with innovative public policy, a place to forge collective future that is better for all of us, which I hope and believe is a world where housing can be a human right. I'm going to turn the mic over now to the amazing Professor Mary Pattillo. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That's a great introduction to some of the things that I'll be talking about. Amanda, I'll just point out that Dr. Bowman has arrived, so we'll all take a second to wave. It's a pleasure to be here, an honor to be here in the lecture series that honors Dr. Phil Bowman, who I've also known for about 30 years now. So thank you for the invitation and thanks everyone for coming. So building on many of the things that Lisa has introduced, it might seem straightforward to think about housing as a right, but really it is anything but. There are echoes of this idea. For example, in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, it states, everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate
a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services. As Lisa pointed out, 89, but actually it's gone down. I was checking the recent statistics. 84 countries have an explicit reference to housing as a right in their constitutions, and the United States does not, as we have heard. The closest that we get to it is 1949, where the Housing Act of 1949 says the Congress hereby declares that the general welfare and security of the nation and the health and living standards of its people require the realization as soon as feasible of the goal of a decent home and a suitable living environment for every American family. We are this year celebrating the 75th year anniversary of the Housing Act of 1949, and I do think it's something to rally around, this last statement of a decent home and suitable living environment for every American family. So we had this goal 75 years ago, but this goal is not a right. So the lack of such a right today means that there are roughly 650,000 people in the US who are unhoused. Roughly 186,000 of them are families with children. It means that of folks who are housed, 30% of all households and nearly 50% of renter households live in housing that is unaffordable to them. And that 9% of poor households live in inadequate housing, which is defined as having vermin or having cracks that make it unsafe, or having other, no plumbing, no running water. So 9% of poor households live in inadequate housing. All of these indicators show disparities by race and ethnicity. So in the matter of homelessness, we know that Black families are overrepresented among the unhoused by a factor of 4 nationally. In the matter of affordable housing, we know that Latino households are 1.5 times as likely as white families to live in housing that's unaffordable to them. And as far as inadequate housing goes, we know that Native American families, now I can't see the statistics, but they are much more likely to live in inadequate housing than are white. 2.5 times, I have it in my notes, 2.5 times as likely to live in inadequate housing as our white families. So my job today is to just think a little more conceptually and then offer some of the research that exists around housing as a right. And so I'll present some of the research, some of the concepts, some of the ideas from around the world, and then some of the social movements that claim this right through collective action. So rather than defining the housing problem as one of being insufficient income to afford the commodity cost of housing, critical theorists posit that the mere fact of the commodification of housing is the core problem that gets in the way of realizing a right to housing. So this commodification of housing means that it exists in a market of buyers and sellers, and that it has a price. And of course, this is no pure economic market, as no such thing exists, but rather a market that exists within systems of racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, classism, anti-immigrant sentiment, xenophobia, et cetera, which impacts the price of housing and also impacts the wages of folks who build housing as well. So we know that currently it is very difficult to build housing that would be affordable to people with very low incomes. So it's not just the wages of people who build housing, but obviously the wages of these groups to be able to afford housing in the first place. And so low income populations are not served by this market. And thus people who call for the right to housing argue that to realize this right, housing must be taken out of the market or must be decommodified. And I'll talk about how far we get to that and how many strategies are really just on the road to that. So historically, in 1872, this idea of a right to housing obviously goes even before 1872, but Frederick Engels, who was a collaborator of Karl Marx, who people know much more, wrote a book called The Housing Question. And in it, Engels writes, quote, "As long as the capitalist mode of production continues to exist, it is folly to hope for an isolated solution of the housing question or of any other social question affecting the fate of the workers. The solution lies in the abolition of the capitalist mode of production and the appropriation of all the means of life and labor by the working class itself." So the solutions proposed under the vision of a right to housing range from those that are most faithful to this Marxist idea of the means of production being appropriated by the working class to other much more moderate models of state or collective community regulation, provision, and protection of housing access for everyone, especially those not served by the market. So I'll talk about this range of ideas. There are two books that I would commend to you on this topic of the right to housing. The first is a 2012 volume edited by Neil Brenner, Peter Marcuse, and Margit Mayer, entitled "Cities for People, Not for Profit." The authors argue that cities are the central sites of contemporary capitalist relations. Thus, local experiences of, for example, homelessness, gated communities, downtown office building construction, and condo conversions, which we might think of as very different parts of the housing market, are indeed all linked together through the intensification of capitalist relations, through such processes as financialization, which is a really big word, but we all know it because if I say subprime loans, that's what I'm talking about. These layers of financialization in the housing market that go well beyond our desire to just have four walls and a roof, to instead create profit for ever more groups of invisible players. So these forms of capitalist intensification is what links all of the kinds of things we see, from the exclusion of certain populations in the form of unhoused populations to the most privileged in gated communities or condo conversions. So in this book, the authors talk more about the more Marxist tradition of a right to housing and give examples of places that exist, but they also are not completely optimistic that this will be realizable. Indeed, while they push for the decommodification of housing, in general, they conclude, quote, "Perhaps the best we can do right now is to redirect that Keynesianism," which is basically a form of an economic theory that tries to push redistribution. So redirect that Keynesianism in such a way that it benefits the mass of the people rather than continue to centralize capitalist class power. So it moves in the direction of the more moderate proposals, which I'll turn to now. So the second book is a 2006 edited volume called A Right to Housing, edited by Rachel Bratt, Michael Stone, and Chester Hartman. And it's generally more pragmatic, more gradualist, more conversant with the existing forms of attempts to build affordable housing and to serve populations not served by the market. So the motivation for the right to housing in this book is not centrally Marxist theory, but rather, as stated in the book's first lines, quote, "The unconscionable fact that in the 21st century, upwards of 100 million people in the United States live in housing that is physically inadequate, in unsafe neighborhoods, overcrowded, or way beyond what they can realistically afford," end quote. So the rights case is made in straightforward terms. It's based on this normative call for justice. It's based on a practical analysis of the harms borne by people facing severe housing problems and the consequent costs to society. And it's based on the fact that our housing crisis creates a threat to democracy that exists when people's basic needs are not met. So the proposals in this book are concrete. For example, there is a chapter by Michael Stone where he goes through various strategies of social ownership. And this includes housing that's not owned or operated for profit, but rather for the collective good, and brings no speculative growth for the owner, usually a collective owner. So examples of this social ownership include public housing, housing built by nonprofit organizations, limited equity cooperatives, and community land trusts. So under this social ownership, there's the elimination of profit, and that elimination of profit moderates prices and makes the housing more affordable for all, although we have so few examples of this. The for all is, of course, needs a much greater expansion of these kinds of models. So how do we get to a right to housing? Well, we get to a right to housing through organizing and activism. In another book by Peter Marcuse and his co-author, they write that, quote, housing movements are popular struggles by those for whom housing means home, not real estate. And I think that was so clear in how Lisa crafted her statements around a place to call home, not a place to call a piece of property or a place to call an investment, but a place to call home. So it is housing struggles that foreground this place to call home that are part of this movement as for housing as a right. So just a few examples. First, I want to go beyond the US because the world population became majority urban in 2008 as a result of tremendous rural to urban migration in developing countries. So in many ways, we think of New York City as the big city, but New York is a baby city compared to Delhi and Sao Paulo and Shanghai and Dhaka and Lagos. So most of these countries have limited state capacity to build housing to meet the needs of its growing population. And so it's in these places where people have embodied the right to housing by claiming land. It's in these places where by their sheer numbers, they build homes and with varying degrees of success, commandeer access to electricity, water, and information networks through such things as cables and internet connections and other kinds of digital connections. So these informal settlements exist on the outskirts of cities, on parts of publicly owned land, and in the interstices of the already developed parts of the city as well. These are the most body forward examples of claiming a right to the city and claiming a right to housing through one's own sweat, labor, and one's own presence. In the US, the formal sector dominates. And so there aren't many examples of the appropriation of housing or land through such practices as squatting or informal settlements. But there are some, and I talk about a few here. So again, to give you some book suggestions, Max Ramo's book, Take Back the Land, Gentrification and the Umoja Village Shantytown, tells the story of how in 2006, a group of activists occupied a public plot of land in Miami for months and offered a model for community care and empowerment. And then more recently in Oakland, California, Moms for Housing, which was a collective of unhoused women and mothers in Oakland, California, occupied 3 homes in 2019 to stop a developer from flipping them for profit. Ultimately, after failed attempts to evict the moms, the moms were able to get a nonprofit to buy the houses and create a community land trust. They also sparked statewide legislation to deter developers from buying housing through tax sales en masse and then waiting to speculate before redeveloping and putting back on the market. So there's a series of it's like a documentary series called The Moms of Magnolia Street for anyone who's interested in that. In the US, there's considerable research regarding public housing policies and displacement. And public housing is supposed to be the place where people are already realizing a right to housing, but public housing residents themselves have had to claim their right to housing, even in public housing. And there are many examples. Mario Small's work about Puerto Rican activists in Boston, Rhonda Williams' work on the organizing of Black women in Baltimore public housing. Where's my page 5? In Minneapolis, Ed Getz's book about the negotiations for desegregated public housing and insisting on the maximum number of units of public housing to be built. And here in Chicago, Bradford Hunt, Sudhir Venkatesh, and Roberta Feldman have all written about various efforts to insist on the growth of public housing rather than its demise. The other strand of public housing relates to the Hope 6 plan that and the plan for transformation that Lisa mentioned. So Hope 6 is a federally funded plan that planned to demolish 100,000 units of public housing across the country. Chicago was the city where the largest number of units have been demolished. And indeed, the national Hope 6 has demolished even more than 100,000 units. And it went alongside the Quality Housing and Work Responsibility Act of 1998, which lowered the percentage of public housing units reserved for the poorest families, which are the families that are really only served by public housing. I mean, many of our other housing programs, we were just talking about the tax credit units, don't actually reach the poorest of the poor. And so the Quality Housing and Work Responsibility Act lowered the percentage of public housing units reserved for the poorest families, and also got rid of this requirement that for every unit that a city demolished, it had to build a new unit to replace it. So as a result, we've seen a decline in the number of hard public housing units. And even before that, we saw processes, and today, as I'll talk about at the end, of de facto demolition, meaning the disinvestment from public housing to the point that it becomes too expensive to renovate and thus requires its demolition rather than its renovation. So my own research in the Oakland neighborhood in the late 1990s and early 2000s is an example of this. It narrates the story of the 900-unit lakefront properties, which authorities announced in 1986 were to be vacated. And they said that they were going to renovate them in 1986. But the residents who lived there had seen this movie before, and they were skeptical. And so when everyone else was relocated, 30 residents stayed, and they were determined to monitor and enforce agreements that the people who had lived there could come back. One organizational leader commented, quote, "Just because we're poor and living in public housing doesn't mean we'll allow ourselves to be taken advantage of. We'll do whatever is necessary to ensure that we remain where we're at." Since we have seen this movie before, the units were demolished, and it is really both the demolition of the physical buildings and the demolition of the history and the memory, in that these long periods of redevelopment allow the Chicago Housing Authority to basically go back on promises because of the long period of development and the fact that there aren't people documenting the units lost. We're seeing that today with the Lathrop homes. The journalists at Block Club Chicago just recently reported on the stalled and now supposedly restarted renovations at the Lathrop homes, where there had been 925 units of public housing. There are now only 488 apartments. And the plan is to build 797, but we shall see, because this again is this long history of forgetting what the promises are. So to conclude, these cases make clear the tension between housing as a commodity, especially as these local public housing authorities are pushed more and more in a revenue generating model rather than providing housing and services. And on the other hand, housing as a right, which has been the domain of the activists that I have tried to highlight. So public housing residents joined by renters, workers, and housing advocates across the color and class lines recognize the absence of a universal entitlement and thus have constantly waged struggles to reiterate that claim. And I'm so glad that we'll hear from some of those folks who are doing that work today. And with that, I turn the mic over to them.
So my presentation today was really about the housing innovation. So with all of these issues of people getting displaced, especially people of color getting displaced out of their community. And these are communities that are, marginalized, people who are marginalized, and over time, no one's invested in those communities, right? And then suddenly people wake up one day and they're like, well, this is close to a train station. This place that we've ignored is somewhere, right? And then that's when you have gentrification, right? And then when you really look at the word gentrification, people of color, especially Black folks, have been made very afraid of this because it typically means that if it happens in your community, you no longer get to be there, right? But the word gentrification actually stands for the gentry coming in. It's an economic thing, not a race thing. We've turned it into this race thing, right? And so one of the things that I've done as a real estate developer, so I am one of those real estate developers, but I'll say that my background is urban planning, and I love being a planner. And before I got into urban planning, I was into architecture in high school, and I went to Cornell to study architecture, and then urban planning was the thing that I landed on because it was the first time I heard about serving people, and that's sort of like how I grew up, right? I grew up a Haitian immigrant to this country. We landed in Brooklyn. And I always tell people the $1.50 per square foot Brooklyn, as opposed to the $1,500 per square foot. And then we ended up in this small town outside of New York City called Nyack, and all the hippies lived there. And then I got to Ithaca, more hippies, and it was, so I feel safe in those places. So as a planner, I was really frustrated with the fact that you can come up with these amazing plans, and planners really try to understand every aspect of a development, every aspect of a community. And it helps me today as a private developer. It helps me understand the communities that I want to serve. However, the planners didn't understand the financial aspect of these things, right? They didn't understand how to take the project across the finish line and put the capital stacks together. And that's sort of the thing that drove me to explore something different. So I got into public policy. So I thought policy was going to solve it all. What I found with policy is that policy takes a very long time. And then when you finally come up with policy that you think works, no one enforces it, right? And then I would look across and see the real estate developers, those evil real estate developers. And what they did well was they executed on projects, right? They were able to navigate the politics. They were able to navigate, not well, but they kind of checked the boxes when it came to community, and they lied, right? They told you what you wanted to hear, but at the end, they didn't do it because they knew things would take a certain amount of time and you'd forget, or people don't have the resources to actually document these things. And so over time, I wanted to be a different type of developer. I still saw development as a way of addressing some of these issues, but I wanted to be a different type of developer, more of like, and I think development has to change. It has to change in two kind of substantial ways. One way is developers have to stop being, when a developer comes in and they'll tell you what they do, right? I build mixed use, I build office, I build retail. And so when they get to a community, right, they don't care what the community actually needs. They just do what they do, right? If they build office, they'll build a bunch of office, even though the market may not be the right for office. And so I always wanted to be the developer that would come in and meet community where they are. And as an urban planner, it starts with conversation. Where do you want to go? What do you want to do? And so it helps us because it saves us months of basically pushing something onto the community that they don't want. So we'll come in, if you look at our portfolio, we have 2,500 square foot spaces, and we have light manufacturing, we have affordable housing. That's the bulk of what we do because that's the biggest need. And I always wanted to be the development company that serves the most vulnerable people. And what I was prepared to present today is the concept of a care house. And what I've noticed is you go into these communities and everyone wants home ownership, but the homes are decaying. And when you actually take the time to go and talk to folks, it's the elderly folks that have hung on to this community that's been disinvested in. And the homes are actually no longer safe for them to live in, right? They can't get up the stairs, and you've seen it, the row house with the makeshift ramp to get into it. And these homes are oftentimes opportunities, right, for younger families to get into those homes, right? So we came up with Care House, and this is an integrated type thing because, you know, we are partners on this. We have an architect, we have an artist, and we have a real estate developer, right? And so on the art side of it, right, a lot of times we build buildings and then we think of art, right? This was, let's put the art forward. Let's think of the art and how this art is going to serve. Who do we want to serve? Well, not only the seniors that are in these homes that are trapped, we want to serve them, but we also want to serve the caregivers. And the caregivers are typically women. They're typically, you know, women with children, low income, right? And so you start to wonder, well, these senior homes, people are paying $7,000, $10,000, $12,000. Where does all that money go? Because it doesn't go to the actual people doing the work. And so we saw this as an opportunity to actually serve two sets of folks, care receivers and caregivers, right? And then to build something beautiful that helps, the nasty word, gentrify the community, right? And what I mean by gentrification, and I teach as well, not at your level. I do teach, I teach MBAs at Booth. And the whole concept is, how do we improve the community without displacing folks? Because if you bifurcate the displacement out of gentrification, it's actually a really good thing. You know, resources coming into the community, but you've solved the problem of the most vulnerable. So that's why when we go into communities, we largely build and try to preserve affordable housing, because then that allows us to do the next step, which is, you know, gentrifying the community, bringing in more resources, and then really using density as a tool, right? So on this corner for the Care House, that used to be, you know, 4 row houses, and we've turned 4 row houses into a 21-unit apartment building that is going to be for both caregivers and care receivers. And on the ground floor, we're going to have a cafe that's sort of like an adult daycare, where the adults in the building get served, but then adults in the neighborhood also get served. And then it's an opportunity to serve the kids of the, you know, caregivers, right? Having resources. And then we're connecting to the arts. We're connecting to all these things that are right there in the urban context. And really, with a building like this, you don't typically see something like this in a marginalized community. It's going to encourage more development to happen. But across the street, we already have affordable housing that's happening. So our thing is, if we're going to, you know, get rid of affordable units, you have to double, if not triple, the replacement of affordable housing. So, you know, we're talking a lot, and I can't wait for the interaction, because, you know, we want to solve this issue with innovation. But then the other critical part, and I don't think we talk about it enough, is who gets to develop, right? And so that's what our fund is all about. There is no talk of giving equity and capital to women and minorities to develop real estate. And I always think women are a lot more intelligent than men, and they should be doing more, and they do more, but they're always in the background. They're the ones doing all the work, but not getting all the credit. And that happens to a lot of minority folks as well. And so, you know, in order to actually shift what's happening and to have a real conversation about the balance between, you know, publicly owned, you know, jointly owned, privately owned, I think we need to understand that that conversation can't happen until we get more equity and democracy in who gets to develop real estate. Right now, 98+% of the capital, the trillions of dollars that are invested in real estate every year, it's a handful of white males that get to do that. Just a handful, right? And if I say the word Donald Trump, that's the handful. That's the image, right? And less than 2% of that capital goes to women and all minorities for the most part combined, right? And so that's where the problem starts. And I think that's where part of the solution starts. Who gets to develop? And then when we do develop, how do we innovate? Because the entire solution is not going full on Marxist and like taking land and joint ownership, because while joint ownership works at a certain level, where it starts to fail, and I've seen it fail, is when there are issues and all those joint owners can't come up with the capital to maintain these properties, you know, so there are issues and there are reasons why you have private ownership. And I'd love to keep this conversation going. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting Pico today. So my name is Karen Leon, and I am very proud to be the co-president and the active member of the first housing cooperative in Pilsen, which we call Pico, the Pilsen Housing Cooperative. Today, I'm going to tell you about Pico and also about my own family's journey with housing in Chicago. So our co-op is in Pilsen. As you know, Pilsen is one of the most well-known Mexican and Mexican-American neighborhoods in Chicago. Our neighborhood is gentrifying rapidly. The rents are going up and many people are having to move. These are longtime residents of Pilsen who are being displaced. In 2000, our community was 88% Latinx, and today is 68% Latinx. The result is that the Mexican artists and immigrant families who made Pilsen unique can no longer afford to live in our community. This is erasing the culture and the heart in our neighborhood. And this gentrification is the reason why Pilsen residents in 2017 began to form Pico. Today, Pico owns 3 buildings. That is 18 apartments and 18 families that are homeowners in our co-op. I live in the first building, the one with the colorful mural. We are anti-displacement project. This means all our members are longtime Pilsen residents. For instance, I have lived in Pilsen neighborhood for 24 years, since I came from Mexico City in the 2000s. My upstairs neighbor, Steve, lived in Pilsen 55 years. Our co-op is affordable. Our shares have sold from between 60K and 160K. By putting our resources together, we can pay down payments that are comfortable for us. For instance, $2,000 to $5,000. This is very affordable home ownership. Other families who have more savings can put more money down. This benefits them and it benefits the co-op. We are neighborhoods supporting neighborhoods to become owners. One big advantage to Pico is our families do not have to get loans in our own. The loan is on Pico's name. This is a big help for lower income people and self-employed people or artists. Like my husband, he is a mariachi, he is a musician. Pico has never checked a credit score or verified anyone's income. We choose members because they fit the mission of Pico. Of course, we also have to be able to pay the monthly housing charges every month, and no one has ever missed a payment, even in the pandemic. For instance, I have a 4-bedroom apartment in 100,000 square feet. I'm sorry if I missed something. The bedrooms are small, but I pay $1,300 for month compared to other rents in Pilsen, even rents in subsidized housing. This is very affordable. One very important thing about our co-op our housing is not about trying to make a profit. We do earn equity. For instance, I pay $2,000 for my share. If I sold today, I will take $8,000 with me. But we have a cap on the sale of our apartments. I cannot flip the apartment and make a profit. I don't ever want to sell my share in Pico. I tell my 3 children, one of you need to take this apartment when I'm not here anymore. But if my family decides to sell, the price cap means the apartment will still be affordable for the next family. They will benefit the same way my family has benefited. I mentioned that working class and artist families are being displaced from our community. We have 17,000 fewer Latinos today than when I arrived to Pilsen in the 2000s. I think if I did not find Pico, my family may also be displaced. I want to tell you a little more about my family. I am the co-founder of Mariachi Mexico Vivo, together with my husband, Enrique Leon. We have a 10-member band. We play all over Chicago, corporate events, community events, religious events. And I have decided myself to supporting and developing the musical and artist talent in my family and community. As a family of artists, our income varies along from year to year, every month to month. This sometimes make finding housing very challenging. My family lived in a no-profit, affordable housing in Pilsen for many years, but no one year when we made too much income in our music business, we lost our affordable housing. We have to leave. Finding a new apartment in Pilsen was very difficult, and even applying for an apartment, it's very expensive. We have to pay $100 for the credit check for everyone over 18 in our family, for every apartment we apply to. Our savings disappear very quickly. We moved to a place where we pay a lot in rent, $1,500 for 2-bedroom only. And we are a family of 5, plus 2 dogs. The electricity was $500 per month because it was not connected correctly, but we felt we could not say anything. We also investigate the possibility of buying a home, but even though we were paying high rents, we did not earn enough to get a loan, and we could not afford anything in Pilsen. Our savings had disappeared just trying to find a housing. Joining Pico has been a transformative experience, both personally and professionally. It has provided stability and community, not only to me, but so many artists and families in Pilsen. Through Pico, I've discovered new ways to connect my community. I firmly believe that when we have a stable, safe housing, we are able to optimize all the aspects in our lives, emotional, financial, and family. Having a stable place to call home creates confidence, nurtures success, and allows for self-actualization. This allows you to better contribute to your community, your art, your passions, and all your talents. For me and my family, for example, having a stable and secure housing has meant that I have been able to focus on growing our music business because I know what our housing costs will be. We were able to purchase a new van for our mariachi. We travel every weekend to the city, suburbs, and even out the state. With housing costs under control, Pico families can invest in family, art, community, health, education, also in our small businesses. I am developing new skills. For instance, this is new for me, talking to you right now about Pico, about housing, and English. Being a co-president and co-board in some and my co-op board is something new. It is something I am learning along with Pico. The day our co-op held our board election was the first time I have been able to vote in this country. I have been able to recognize the impact I can have in my community and contribute to the preservation of our culture, music, art, and affordable housing. I am very active in trying to create more Pico housing so more families can stay in Pilsen. Housing is the most often seen as an investment in this country. Sometimes like you buy to later on making a profit. In Pico, we believe that the value of our housing is home. The value is community. The value is stability and safety. It is culture. It is something we can leave to our children, but it is not about to profit or making money. I do value the world I am building in Pico. For 24 years, I rented. I have nothing to show for that. 24 years of paying rent, in my opinion, the city should support more co-ops and help create more owners. Pico is helping our members developing careers. We are growing healthy, happy families and safe communities. And we are building awareness that living in community with others is good for all of us. Thank you for allowing me to share a glimpse on my journey and a little bit about the Pilsen Housing Co-op. Our slogan is Quédate en Pilsen, stay in Pilsen. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm also very grateful to be a part of this this discourse community. My name is Dr. ShaDawn. Okay. Dr. ShaDawn Boobie Battle. I am an assistant professor of critical ethnic and Black studies at Xavier University. Resident of, well, I'm not really a resident of Chatham according to my license, but I still live in Chatham. My family is still here. And I'm also the 5th artist instigator for the National Public Housing Museum. And so I am a Chicago footwork practitioner or former practitioner or a practitioner turned cultural critic / scholar, artivist. So, I think that one way to fight for housing as a human right is to examine or to continue examining the objectification or the objectifying and the dehumanizing effects of inequitable housing practices and to situate cultural production squarely within this discourse. You really can't argue for housing as a human right, when our practices reveal the refusal to recognize the humanities of specific groups, especially people of African descent. So I'll begin with legal history as well. So to enforce the 13th Amendment or the abolition of slavery, as well as the reimposition of the slave status of Black people in various guises, Congress passed the 1866 Civil Rights Act. In doing so, they basically said when you deny Black people access to housing, it becomes a mark of slavery. Although in 1883, the Supreme Court said, well, wait a minute, access to housing is not a badge of slavery. It still stands that Congress once considered access to housing a human right, a legal measure that would help rid this nation of actions that likened Black people to the status of the non-being. In my research, I've explained how the denial of public housing and affordable housing continues to strip marginalized groups of their humanities, a true sense of freedom in this land, and an ability to self-actualize. I've explained how housing practices in Chicago mainly have had dehumanizing outcomes for Black and brown folks and were the result of the presumed subhumanity of Black people. So housing becomes sort of this mechanism through which Black folks are always sort of locked in the realm of the non-human, which it's as a consequence reimposes slave status. So for instance, I tell the story of how my grandfather, who's now sort of battling early onset dementia, but he lived at, and he tells me this every time we're on the Dan Ryan and we're passing 55th Street. And so he lived at 4944 South Wentworth when the construction of the Dan Ryan began and was forced to relocate. And my grandfather was a policy man, And so he ran the numbers, and the tenant above him at 4944 South Wentworth, Mrs. Everett, ran the numbers for him. So he needed to keep up with Mrs. Everett, and her whereabouts. And so he said she was forcibly moved. She had to forcibly move to a property on Wells Street, assuming she was out of the intended construction site, right? And then once the highway was completed, and he was like, I had to keep looking for her, right? She was displaced again, right? And so, like Mrs. Everett, my grandfather and thousands of others, we can argue that the systematic segregation, because the expressway will widen the chasm that had already separated Black and white families at the time, but so that racial segregation was dehumanizing because Black bodies were essentially mere chess pieces constantly dislodged, right, for the sake of commercial enterprise. Then we think about the high rises, how the high rises came about, right? So Ta-Nehisi Coates calls this the creation of the second ghetto following the striking down of racial covenants in the late 40s. Dr. Pattillo and others have discussed the subsequent intentional, like, sort of concentration of public housing structures in Black neighborhoods, which restricted Black people to segregated projects, and the sociological consequences, right, of these isolated social environments. So when I think of the architecture, the social, the political, the economic intent of their construction, and the often animalizing outcomes of concentrating poverty through public housing high-rise structures, I think of the lyrics by the best rapper in the world. You know why they call a project? Because it's a project, an experiment. We're in it, only as objects. These lyrics have always evoked images of public housing used to warehouse Black bodies, and to keep them from essentially invading and defiling white spaces. And then we can also think about how housing practices have revealed the perceived non-humanity of Black folks. If we look at Algo Gardens, and the intentional depositing of Black war vets and the decades of Black families thereafter into an area that was already known for its toxic waste and chemicals, and an area that would be declared as having the highest toxicity or the highest concentration of toxicity in the country. This was a clear exercise of what Foucault might call biopolitical power, or essentially how certain bodies, we let certain bodies or certain people or certain groups live, and we let others die. In this case, Black bodies were rendered disposable assemblages of matter, with each generation of residents dying from cancer and other respiratory related illnesses. The only time in history when we can really think of human beings being placed in death traps like this, it's because those in power basically saw no human involved, to echo the language of Sylvia Winters. In my research, I explore other examples of the ways in which housing practices have just reduced Black folks or relegated Black folks to the realm of the non-human. But I want to end with this one. Housing practices continue to violate the 13th Amendment, reducing Black people to the status of the non-being, insofar as this dispossessing Black folks of their home places also means dispossessing them of culture, and by extension, an ability to self-actualize. Stuart Hall argues that culture is experience lived, experience interpreted, and experience defined. So culture is a way that we make sense of the world in which we exist and who we are in that world. So to deny Black people the spaces wherein culture is constantly produced and reproduced is to cause a kind of social death. And for most Black communities fighting to live in the face of these interlocking systems of oppression, our homes are where we harness culture to survive. Bell Hooks said that home place was a site of resistance for Black people. She was mostly speaking within a Black feminist context, but a site of resistance for Black people where they could freely resist dehumanization, strive to be subjects, curate culture, and affirm themselves. In his first novel, The Water Dancer, Ta-Nehisi Coates called the world of the slave quarters, which house our cultural secrets, the down there. In an interview, Coates explained that, quote, living in the down there yields a certain kind of enlightenment and insight and freedom and democracy that you can't get without actually being down there and living in it. In the book, his protagonist recalls this freedom in the down there is rooted in African-American cultural expression and oral history. Here's what he says, his protagonist. I marveled at the bonds between us, the way we shortened our words or spoke sometimes with no words at all. The shared memories of corn shuckings, of hurricanes, of heroes who did not live in books, but in our talk, an entire world of our own, hidden away from them. And to be a part of that world, I felt even then was to be in on a secret that was within you. By comparison, the physical dwelling spaces to which Black folks have been confined in the city have become our down there, where stories are told, rhythms are created, traditions are passed down, and there are spaces through which social affinities are determined. The youth this past Monday, so the project that I proposed with the National Public Housing Museum is called Place Space Works, and we're working with youth of Kumba Links and various scholars and community organizers, et cetera. And we launched a workshop series, right? And so for the third workshop, it was on land sale contracts, and it was led by Tanika Lewis-Johnson, who's doing excellent work on land sale contracts, specifically focused in Inglewood. And she asked you, tell me your name and tell me where you live, how do you identify home in your neighborhood, right? And they identified their homes and their neighborhoods, almost all of them, through their cultural identities and affinities, right? I'm not sure if you're going to be able to hear this clearly, but I'll give it a shot. And this is just phone footage. We actually have real footage, but
I felt connected to the most was the city, which is 127 Calumet Park. That's why I feel connected, because a lot of my family stayed with us.
yeah, you can't hear it. So basically he says, he felt most connected to 127th Street because that's where he learned footwork and developed a community, right? And so this is a DJ Clint. In recent interviews, he basically explained how growing up in 3939 Lake Park, allowed him to sort of change the sounds of the claps in Chicago footwork music, because the concrete walls it basically just revolutionized what we call ghetto house music, right? And so doing so earned him the title of the low end legend. And I've spoken to others who said that you really just wanted to be in those parties, to be a part of this ghetto house culture, right? And then when I interviewed Dr. David Stovall, he said the following: but while you're having parties, buildings are coming down, right? So the demolition of these structures in Chicago was not just a loss of infrastructure and mere matter, right? It was an immaterial dispossession, as you said, that we have to account for. One of my business partners, and who's also an Algo Garden resident and footworker, Mad Dog, said about the plan for transformation, he understood it through the Bub Billiken. He said the shorties are dancing right past gentrified spaces where their mothers and their grandmothers used to live before they were forced to migrate to different parts of the city. They doing parade marches past the open field and Mariano's, where the Wells used to stand. The dances they doing and the music was birthed in those spaces. But this is history we don't acknowledge. The kids don't know this, right? And so our goal with this project is to sort of illuminate their consciousness, and so that they can really understand how housing has had dehumanizing impacts on the community, and how the destruction of home place destroys socio-cultural networks, which I argue also is another form of social debt. So if we're going to continue to have conversations about housing as a human right, I think we first have to understand the nuanced ways that contemporary housing practices continue to violate the 13th Amendment, reducing Black people to the status of non-being, and the importance of expanding the discourse to include the delimiting and the destroying of cultural production, cultural memory, etc. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much to the panelists, and there's some questions coming in. And so what I hate sometimes is when I have people who are like, oh my gosh, we all agree, because obviously we don't all agree on this panel. There are a lot of points, I think, of possible contention, including that I don't think Jay-Z is the greatest rapper that ever existed. Yeah, and I just want to throw out one question first, and then throw it out to Mary, because you kind of set out these two different historical analyses, right? And you start with the angles, and then you kind of say, and there's another one about the justice-based one. And I feel like there is a kind of sense that we agree on the justice, the sort of unconscionableness of when we're living in a certain state. Is that mode of analysis going to get us to housing as a human right? Or are we going to have to also have a critique of racial capitalism? Can you just maybe start us off there a little bit? Yeah.
I guess I would say I'm not optimistic that the justice argument will go far enough, because maybe the justice argument will get enough people to decide it's something we need to work on, but I don't see, and I would love to hear Ernst talk about this, I don't see how the private market can supply. Well, let me do it a different way. I mean, we could address it from the wage angle as well. So if wages were raised to meet housing prices, that would be another strategy. But one could argue that if wages go up, housing prices will go up. And ultimately, it will always be people with more money who can outbid people with less money in the housing market. So I don't think I don't think that would be the way. And so I just don't think it's possible, given the wage structure and given the predominant interest of developers to make the most profit and thus cater to an audience that can pay the most money. I don't see how that's possible within the market. And so I guess my answer then is not that it requires perhaps a full-fledged revolution, but it surely does require a drastic rethinking of the proportion of housing that's in the commodified private sector and the part that's in the collective or public sector.
Cool, yeah, and I want to throw it to you, Ernst, because you also did like a very hip hop thing, reappropriating the term gentrification. But we strive to make it a good thing. And I mean, I do want to say that I remember going to the US Social Forum and I was in a room and young people were sort of saying, we like gentrification, like we actually want resources in our communities and we think we can have gentrification but without displacement. And I guess if you can say a little bit more about that and like just respond a little bit to Mary and you know, we wanted to get in on it, let's get to it, yeah.
Yeah, and I think when we make people, marginalized people, especially Black people, afraid of gentrification, that's the wrong thing, right? It's they should aspire to be the gentry and they should be able to be the gentry, right? And so if we just say, well, gentrification just means not you, then we get these kind of like warped views of solid Black working families and upwardly mobile Black folks. You know, I had a group of folks from MIT with me, students from MIT, and I took them to a neighborhood in Baltimore that had been, you know, all upwardly mobile Black folks that worked for the government, and they just figured out that they can get to DC, not pay $800,000 to $1.3 million for their house, and live in Baltimore but work in DC because it was transit oriented. I took them to that neighborhood, and they saw those folks, and I'm like, okay, just remember what you saw here. And then I took him to a neighborhood of poor white artists that went to MICA. And I said, what do you see here? And they saw gentrification there. And those folks, you know, they were waitering and they didn't have a lot of money. And they made that decision solely based on color. They said, because white people are there, that's a good thing that's happening. And because it's just Black people, even though they have money and they're upwardly mobile and they're educated, they didn't see them as the gentry. And I think that's wrong also. It's also wrong for all folks that have come here, right? Especially of European descent. You know, I come from a shithole country, Haiti, you know, but like all folks that have come here, you work hard. The American dream is you could buy a home, you could make something of yourself, right? And you could own something. And I think it's wrong to give, you know, the next generation of minority kids, because I see it happening in the Bronx. It's shared ownership. So all these other folks got to build wealth. And for the minority folks, we get shared ownership. When do they get to build wealth as well? So I think we've got to re-examine that. And the problem with real estate development and real estate developers is that most developers are exactly what you've described, right? They want to maximize their income. So I say developers have to kind of like, you know, police themselves and actually have standards. But the second you try to standardize development, so think about it, like what career that could profoundly affect community, don't we have a licensing? You know, if you want to be a doctor, there's an oath, right? Do no harm. If you want to be a lawyer, you've got to pass the bar. And then there's ongoing education. So all these things, even to be a CPA, right? To be able to report these things, all these things that could have profound effects on community and society, we license them and then we have continuing education, except for development. All you have to do is be rich or come from the right family. That's what we have to change.
Yeah, no, and let's also remember Katie, successful revolution.
Only,
like
yeah,
people, so,
exactly.
yeah,
I
I
Yeah.
want to ask you, Karen, because, you know, you all have, you know, invented a kind of solidarity economy for cooperative living, right? And you found a different way. I'm kind of curious, how did you learn about this? Like, what was the process of learning about cooperative housing and doing this work?
Well, the necessity, the gentrification, we saw a lot of families that were displaced. So, and I found this group of artists that they had the idea to construct this kind of co-op, to get all together, all the people that were displaced to get in one place. So all together, get all the money and get the information. We have with another co-op in Humboldt Park. So they help us to get all the information and how to make the democracy, the construction, the bylaws, everything that we need to know to get all this together. So yeah, I was the necessity.
Yeah, wow. ShaDawn, do you want to get in on this? You don't speak up.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry.
I think that both have to, I think that they have to coexist, right? Like, the justice-based model and, you know, dismantling the capitalist structure. And I could be wrong, but the way that I understand even this sort of this collective like ownership model is that it's still based on capital and it still has the potential to be transactional and commodifying, right? So I think that in order for housing to be completely egalitarian and equitable, right, there has to be a means of stepping outside of the capitalist model, which is going to require a complete revolution, right? A complete social and economic upheaval. That would be.
Yeah, and I think I want to point people also to Mary's amazing essay that you sort of have written about sort of housing as a human right versus a commodity, because it really also dwells a lot on this question of space and like how do we understand spatial relationships. Like if you're living in a McMansion, quote unquote, like what is your relationship to your kid who is, you know, in a room upstairs or versus, and so there's these really deep ways of movement, like to think about your project also around this construction space and how it's affecting us. I'm going to go to some of these questions online. Somebody asked us, why do you think the referendum for Bring Chicago kind of failed? Right, it was one of the hotly contested referendums for the real estate transfer tax. It was also a lot of money invested by the real estate sort of field in making sure it didn't pass. That maybe is my answer. But you know, I mean that's like both fact and an answer. And you know, I also think maybe I think the fight again for it, maybe like it used terms like it's a mansion tax. It pitted people against one another instead of trying to see this as a collective movement for all of us, because it's something that really does impact all of us. But do people, Mary or anyone?
I would love to know if there are any political scientists in the audience who know better, but my interpretation is it was a midterm election with very low voter turnout, and low voter turnout usually means it's the more regular voters who are usually more affluent who show up in midterm elections that don't have as much at stake. You know, this was a presidential primary where the primary candidates were already decided. It was a relatively low stakes election. So if you have then that favoring more affluent voters, then I could see how it lost.
Chicago is, you know, you had the daily machines, right? Chicago is like a kleptocratic governing system and economic structure, right? And so that was asking for a radical restructuring. Really it was not, right? But for those who felt as if that they would lose the most, right, it was radical. And I do think that when you don't have a high like voter turnout, right, it's really hard to flip the ballot.
I'm maybe just gonna call out one of the people who was online as a longtime public housing tenant who led a fight against demolition of a space, Alazan and Apache Courts, one of the oldest public housing properties. So thank you for that. And the question is really like, how do we actually build public housing in the United States? Like, what is the sort of call for us as denizens of this country to make the government responsible to its people in terms of housing? I mean, I think something that the museum is really invested in doing is seeing it as a cultural and social movement. It is, policy, like there's certain things like whether we have to overturn the Fair Call Amendment or whatever it is, but it's also convincing people that public housing is not a failure, right? I mean, there's this overwhelming narrative that it failed, and the narrative is so much dependent on a racialized stereotype of who lives in public housing and doesn't tell the true story. So I think making a much more capacious narrative and having a better analysis and being students of history can only help us actually build more public housing as part of this process. But do other people have a sense of wanting to answer Caleb?
Can I just, a lot of public housing did fail, right? And it failed the people that lived in the public housing, right? And so, when it's a third party developer, it's easy to say, okay, well, you go fix, and I see this in New York, right? Where, they thought they had a $5 billion problem to fix New York City's public housing, but it was more like a $55 billion problem. And they had to go to the private sector to come and help to renovate. They maintained the affordability, but it needed sort of like private capital to come and actually help renovate those units. And then I kind of go back to it's the actors, it's who gets to develop. And I think the people that think equitably, the people that think like planners, that think about community, they need to like roll up their sleeves and get into developing real estate, as opposed to saying, well, it's those. And so like we've been kind of like told that only these people can do real estate development. And I think that's the problem. That's where the democracy needs to happen. That's where in a city like Baltimore, for instance, almost 70% Black, over 55% women, how less than 2% of people of color and women get to develop real estate, it makes no sense, because they have no sense of that the overwhelming majority has no say in the actual construction and delivery of housing. And so if we can change that, I think that's part of the solution.
But I mean, all of our public spending decisions are political decisions, right? And so let's begin with the fact that HUD, for example, gets a much smaller proportion of the budget than the Department of Defense, for example. And then within HUD, the mortgage interest deduction is a much bigger program than all of the programs that are addressed at lower income families. So our inability to maintain public housing is a political choice, not a financial necessity. And so we could have the billions of dollars to maintain public housing at a level that it would be decent housing in the places where it already isn't. Because there's some places where it has been, where there are models of public housing, where families have raised generations. I just was recently on a project on intergenerational programs and policies to reduce intergenerational poverty. And there is strong evidence that living in public housing, and so you're comparing people who in various kinds of subsidized housing, people who live in subsidized housing versus similar kinds of people who don't live in subsidized housing, has positive effects on the next generation. And that's partially because of the things that we heard from Karen, which is it frees you up to invest in other things, to further your education, to be healthier, to all of those kinds of things. So I think it's a political decision that we could do differently. Now, how do we do it differently, which is your questioner's question, is back to activism and organizing. But I do think we have the capacity to do it differently.
I'm always like hesitant to answer questions like this because I'm oftentimes speaking from sort of the purview of an academic about like the material lives of, of real people. But I think that it is a ideological and or part of it anyway is an ideological and a rhetorical question. Like the way that you began, the way that you framed it was in terms of the social contract, right? So like as denizens of the nation state, they owe us housing as a public good. but like it's never been a social contract. It's always been a racial contract, right? We can't talk about housing as a human right, as I said, because we've got to talk about the ways in which humanity has been defined and you know, these sort of narrow terms. And so I think part of it is, a big part of it anyway, is ideological. It's like violence at the ideological level.
No, and I love how each of the projects of analysis kind of challenges one of our maybe most deeply held ideological normative sensibilities. And I mean, like Ernst's project with Care House, I kept thinking of Lefebvre's book, Right to the City, where he's like, the people who work the city, who clean the city streets, who are caring for people, they have no right to live in the city, right? So reimagining housing for the people and the caregivers, like really shifts that kind of notion. And this whole question of who belongs to a community, people who've been there for 55 years, and how do you privilege that like commitment to place and space, right? So I love that. We're at the end of our time, but I want to end with each of us maybe saying one thing to do or read or something like that. I'm gonna start and say I'm so inspired by Mary's sort of point. Like, I think if we become peace activists, that's a way that we are able to fund more housing. So let's say go out and protest war. Yeah. Go ahead, Karen, what about you?
Okay, just for one thing that everyone takes to home is invest in people. Invest in the value of people, not in the value of the property. Because people have value, that value gives you more value to the property. So it's the only thing I can say, because they give us a step of trust, believing in artists and music and muralists. And we are constructing a big community with people. So yeah, thank you.
This does not originate from me, but I just want to reemphasize what was said today, right? We've got a sort of foreground, this idea of housing, meaning home or signifying home and not real estate, right? I think that stuck with me the most. And so if we begin to sort of shift the narrative, I think that policy might change as well.
Yeah, there just has to be representation in who gets to develop real estate. And I think if we get there, then we'll be more thoughtful, because it'll be more representative of who's in community. So if one small group of people get to do it, you know, it doesn't matter who's in office, we're going to get the same picture, right? And so to get a different picture, you know, there needs to be diversity in who gets to develop real estate.
I'll just end by thanking Karen. I had not heard of PICO, and so I love to come to these. We're supposed to be the experts, but we're also very much learners.
Yeah.
So being on the panel with you, let me be a learner. So thank you.
Awesome. Give yourself a hand. Thank you so much to National Public Housing Museum and IRRPP. There's a beautiful feast outside, so eat a lot of shrimp rolls and things like that. We don't want to take any comment. Thanks for everybody online for joining us too. Yeah. And thanks Dr. Bowman for being Dr. Bowman.